Here in the northern Rockies, dark winter months are outlasted in basements, dens, and nooks, where kindred souls gather to share intel, swap fly patterns, and relive the memories from seasons past. This gathering spot, known locally as a February room, is the inspiration for this podcast. No matter the season, the door is always open to those with a fly fishing story to tell. Brought to you by CD Fishing USA, the North American distributor for Composite Development's fly rods and fishing accessories. Tech, precision, ingenuity, legacy. Go to cdfishing.us and follow us on Instagram, YouTube, and Facebook. Here's your host, Lauren Carnop, and this is the February Room.
Hello, Justin Carnop here, and welcome to the February Room. Today we have the pleasure of speaking with a renowned regional expert on the pursuit of striped bass and trophy striped bass at that. Obviously, as we peel back the onion, we will discover more today, but he is an author, a guide, a fly designer from Georgia. Henry Cowen, welcome to the show.
Hey, Justin, thanks for having me on the February Room.
Well, we appreciate you taking the time to be here. Like most anglers, you wear many hats to keep the dream alive, right?
Yeah, you got to be versatile.
Yeah, that's true. Based on your book and website, it would appear that you were something of a specialist in terms of focusing on one species. But like most guides and those with a fishing problem, you've done a fair bit of traveling around, and I'm sure there's some interesting stories from your home waters as well. So if you wouldn't mind sharing a memory with us from your travels.
Well, sure. So, I'm a New York City kid who ended up down here in Georgia, in Atlanta. But, I grew up in New York City and, fished all around the Big Apple. I mean, literally in Brooklyn, New York is where I grew up. So I cut my teeth saltwater fishing for striped bass. For those people that haven't gotten to New York, New York is one of the best playgrounds for fishing in the United States. It's not just the concrete jungle. We have some fantastic striper fishing in that tri-state area, especially in the city. And so eventually I married a Southern girl, migrated down south here to Georgia, and started pursuing striped bass in freshwater, which differ greatly. Even though they look the same, they differ greatly from striped bass in saltwater when pursuing them. So, one of my most fond memories is, and I'll just lead up to this, and I call this fishing forbidden waters. And what I mean by forbidden waters is anglers have gone for years and fished places that maybe you shouldn't be, let's call it. Let's say, I'm not talking about going in and trespassing on, somebody's ranch and going into their trout water. I would never, ever do something like that. But for instance, as a kid growing up in New York, in my late teenage years, early 20s, we used to fish this place called Lilco, which was the Long Island Lighting Company, and it was a hot water outflow. It made electricity for Long Island. And in the winter, when all the striped bass would migrate back down south and make their run south, there were a bunch of fish that would stay in Long Island all winter because the hot water outflow coming from this electricity plant would keep the bait and the stripers there, and we would sneak into the area that we weren't supposed to fish inside the power plant, which was on Long Island Sound, and catch fish all winter long at night, and nobody would ever see us. And I call that forbidden waters, and everybody's got some forbidden waters. I'm sure you probably got some spots yourself, Justin, that you fished that, maybe weren't really open for the public, but you got in there because you knew there was some good fishing. Is that fair to say?
Oh, something like that probably occurred.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when we fished up in the Croton Reservoir in New York, one of the best runs on the whole Croton was behind a Honda dealership, and you had to go into the Honda dealership behind it, go past the cars and go out there, out their back door and walk down to the river to fish one of the best stretches on the river. And, that's forbidden waters to me. So my story that I'm going to tell you happened to me the week of 9/11 back in 2001. And I was already down here in Atlanta and fishing Lake Lanier for stripers. And right after 9/11 happened, I was actually up in New York when that occurred. And I got back that Saturday after 9/11, which was about 4 or 5 days later. And I went out the next morning fishing on Sunday. I took my boat out, and our lake is 38,000 acres, 650 miles of shoreline, loaded with striped bass. And what the Army Corps of Engineers did to prevent terrorism at that time was they cordoned off the dam on the south end of Lake Lanier, where they put barrels up about a quarter of a mile across the lake. And it just said, do not enter. And that stretch of where the barrels were that said, do not enter, was probably about 2,000 yards away from the dam because they didn't want anybody getting near the dam. They were fearful of a terrorist attack, that somebody would blow up the dam and that would flood all of Atlanta. So, because that's Atlanta's drinking water. So, one of my really most fun memories was I was down there fishing, and I had one of my very dear friends, Dennis Ficco, in the boat. And we were down on the south end of the lake looking for fish in September that would be on top. And lo and behold, we're down by the barrels going across the lake. And inside the barrels, about halfway to the dam, all of a sudden, out of nowhere, like coming up from the depths, we see about 500 striped bass just absolutely start tearing up the water. I mean, it was a full on blitz. And I looked at Dennis and I said, Dennis, get your rod out, strip line out. We're going in. And Dennis looks at me and he's like, are you kidding me? It says do not enter. I said, Dennis, there's nobody here. It's Sunday morning. It's 7:30. Get your line out. We're going in.
Do not enter was just merely a suggestion.
It was a suggestion. Every barrel had the sign that said do not enter. So all of a sudden, I'm in my little, at that point, I was fishing out of a 17-foot 1966 Boston whaler, an old refurbished Boston whaler. And so I get Dennis in the bow of the boat. He strips line out, and I run in between a couple of barrels, and I'm running halfway to the dam, and the fish are just, it looks like somebody's got a blender on the top of the water. If you've never seen a striper blitz, Google Montauk fly fishing, in the fall, and you'll see what these blitzes look like when the fish are just tearing it up. It's a wonderful sight. And we get those little mini blitzes like that, with much fewer fish than they do in Montauk can get 20,000 fish on top. We probably had 500 that morning. And so I pull up to the side of the fish, put the boat broadside so Dennis can make a perfect cast into the blitz. I don't think he got to his second back cast, Justin. And all of a sudden, out from behind the dam comes a boat with 3 engines, about a 28, 30-foot boat with 3 engines on the back, sirens blazing along with lights flashing. And there's a guy on the front of the boat with a 30 caliber machine gun. And he's in the front of the boat with the captain driving towards us. And I'm like, Dennis, sit down. We got to make a run for it. I don't think we even got back to the barrels in time. By the time this INS boat came out of nowhere and plugged us down, and the captain on the boat has got a badge on, and he looks at me, he goes, I don't want to say anything that I'm not allowed to say on this podcast, but he looked at me, and I'll just calm it down. I'll make it children's legible. He looked at me, goes, are you freaking out of your mind? He goes, do you know that we are allowed to shoot when we see you here? Didn't you see the sign on those barrels? And Dennis looks at me and I look at the captain and I said, did you see all those stripers on top on the water before you came blaring out? There had to be 500 fish on the top. And he's shaking his head, and Dennis looks at him, and Dennis is a little older than me. Dennis looks at him, and Dennis is a very, very honest and high integrity guy. He points his finger at me and he looks at the captain. He says, I told him not to go. I told him we shouldn't be doing this, blah, blah, blah. And there was another boat that had followed me in behind me who came in and saw what we did. And out of the blue, I didn't see him until he came in behind me on top of the fish. And then he ran the other way. And I just looked at the officer. I said, don't you think you should go let that guy know that he came in illegally too? And he's shaking his head going, he goes, this is a warning. He goes, I don't want to see you behind these barrels again. But we never did get to make one cast at those fish. But I will just tell you that when you see a gala of fish on top like that, just tearing up the water, whether it's stripers or false albacore or whatever they are, I say, everything else becomes secondary. Your goal is to get to those fish and get some feathers to throw in the middle of that whole thing. It would have been an absolute field day. So that's kind of one of my favorite stories of fishing, quote unquote, forbidden waters.
Yeah, that's a gamble there, buddy. That's a gamble.
Well, you were just hoping that the guy in the INS boat was a fisherman and would have just backed off, but obviously he wasn't. And those fish continued to come up several times when we were behind the barrels, and there's just nothing we could do. We just had to leave and go find some other fish that morning. But I want to say that was around like September 16th, 2001, that happened. And today, that Dennis, when I speak to Dennis, here we are, almost 20 years later, and he'll never forget that story. He'll take that
Oh
to
yeah.
the grave. That was one of the great fishing stories that we've had on our lake. I've had several of those, by the way, those types of encounters. And like I said, you do what you got to do. You don't want to be. I would never trespass someplace that I wasn't invited. I would never do anything like that. But getting into an area just to catch a few fish and quietly leave without disturbing. I mean, come on, are you kidding me? That's what a good guide does. You put your people in fish.
Right, right. I got to go several years ago to Maine, and this guy met me. I had just kind of hooked up with him right before I went out there for a separate work trip, and this fellow that I took fishing here with his grandkid recommended I reach out to this gentleman, and he might just take me on a fishing trip, and so we met at the mouth of the Kennebec. Well, he picked me up in the town of Bath, brought me a burger, and drove me up to the mouth of the Kennebec.
Love it. I've fished there many a time up by Popham Beach in that area.
Yeah, boy, it was incredible, man. The first fish that came in that I was fortunate enough to put a fly in front of, and the fish ate it, and it was in like shin deep water, like bone fishing kind of style. More, I was not aware that you could have a striper experience kind of like that. It was incredible.
Yeah, they're just a fantastic species. Whether you're fishing for them in saltwater or like we do down here in freshwater, it gives you. I am somewhere around 250 miles from the coast, yet I can have a saltwater experience on my lake, and that's the beauty of striper fishing in freshwater is it allows you to have a saltwater experience when you're nowhere near salt water, and you get the birds and you get fish blasting on top, and it's just so exciting. The only difference between that and salt water is you're fishing a lake, so the boat doesn't rock.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Well, that's really cool. They had stripers in some of the lakes around where I grew up in Oregon, and we didn't spend a ton of time targeting them, but we sure gave it hell, and it was not easy. Um, they always seemed to be kind of down deep, or we weren't timing things right. Um, but for whatever reason, we didn't have a lot of success doing that. I'd like to go back and try again someday. But um, anyway, on along those lines, tell me about your guide service.
Well, so I'm here just north of Atlanta. I'm up in Cumming, Georgia, and my fishery mostly is Lake Lanier. I also fish another lake, a little bit smaller lake called Lake Allatoona, which is also just north of Atlanta. I'm about 45 minutes north of Atlanta, and on Lake Lanier we have striped bass, freshwater striped bass, and we also have a species called Kentucky spotted bass. And a lot of people haven't heard of Kentucky spotted bass. They are, if you look at a Kentucky spot, they kind of look like a largemouth, but they act exactly like a smallmouth. But their markings
Cool.
just tend to look more largemouth like, but they don't. They pull a lot harder and they jump, and We have a world-class Kentucky spotted bass fishery. We actually own 2 of the 7 line class records for Kentucky spots in the United States are on our lake, on Lake Lanier. So for us, it's like smallmouth fishing, and we can get, Kentucky spots are probably in somewhere between 30 and 35 lakes around the 35 states around the United States. You can find them in a lot of states across the country. But we have some of the top spotted bass fishing right here in North Georgia on Lake Lanier, and they just pull like the dickens. It's a great fish. And so that's what I fish out of. And then when I go to Allatoona, I fish for hybrids. Not so. There are stripers in Lake Allatoona, but it is loaded with hybrids. So when we get topwater hybrid bites, I'll take my micro skiff over there, and we'll fish for hybrids, which differ from stripers. They're a little more aggressive. Uh, those are fish that are actually they're a combination. When they're not self-reproducing fish, those have to be stocked. And hybrids are a combination between a white bass and a striped bass. They actually take the eggs from one and the sperm from the other, and they put it together and come up with a hybrid. Some people call them vipers and wipers and all sorts, but they're all hybrids. And so I fish for them a little bit here in North Georgia. And then my favorite thing I love to do is in the summertime. I get down I go below Lake Lanier into the Chattahoochee River, which is one of the 2 rivers that runs through our lake. And I take people down on the Chattahoochee River, and we fish off the river on the Oxbow Lakes, which are flats next to the river itself. And we carp fish. We sight fish for carp, poling around in a skiff. You'd think you were bone fishing. The water's not quite as clear as, say, a bonefish flat, but it's a little tannic, but not tannic enough that, when you're pulling around in 10 inches of water, you can see them swimming all around. And I just love, you know what? I like to fish, Justin, where water used to be. You can't get me shallow enough to go fishing.
Sorry, I didn't catch whether or not that Kentucky spotted bass is a native species, or is that a hybrid fish, or is that its own?
No, it's its own species of fish. It's not a hybrid. It's a native species that's here. Some people call them Kentucky spotted bass. Some people call them Alabama spotted bass. But they are spotted bass. And believe it or not, for guys that are interested in the bass fishing tournaments, we've got them all over the country, obviously. When you see whether it's the BASS or whether it's the FLW, or now the new one is the World Fishing League, I think it is, or something like that, where you get all these professional bass anglers. The 3 bass that they allow to be caught in these tournaments are either largemouth, smallmouth, or spotted bass, Kentucky spots. Those are the 3 species allowed in these tournaments across the country. And so Kentucky spots don't get anywhere near as big as largemouth. You hear about people catching 10 and 12 pound largemouth bass, where Kentucky spots are more similar to the size of a smallmouth, which means it's going to be anywhere from 1 to 5 pounds. But we have, if you caught a 4-pound smallmouth on any river or lake in the United States, somebody would look and go, wow, that's a fantastic fish. Our Kentucky spots on my lake, if you catch a 4-pounder, that's just an average big fish that nobody raises an eyebrow. Everybody looks and goes, really nice fish. But that's not a jaw dropper. Anything over 5 to 6 is considered a jaw dropper. So we have a really special Kentucky spotted bass fishery up here as well. But I'm mainly known for targeting stripers. That's what I do. But I love what we call the greenfish, the bass. I love catching them too. They're just a lot of fun. And in the summertime up here on Lanier, while we don't catch the real big ones that time of year, these are mostly 1 to 3 pound fish, but it's all on 6-weight rods and floating lines and poppers. Just throwing any sort of a popper or a pole dancer, a walk the dog kind of fly like Charlie Bishrot's pole dancer. You'll drive these fish crazy. It's really a lot of fun.
So one of the rivers near where I grew up in Central Oregon it's called the John Day, and the John Day was a really fun smallmouth fishery. Now, it was kind of a numbers game, but there was, like the state record came out of there, which was like 7.25 pounds or something. Um, so I kind of grew up doing a lot of that popper fishing for smallies, and it's still definitely one of my favorite methods and favorite fish to target. We do have some opportunity around here in Montana for smallies too. Um, and I did get to go to. I have had occasion to fish up in like the north woods of Wisconsin and on the Mississippi and some of those other rivers up there, where they attain a bigger size class, and they're a real dark green bass as opposed to the ones kind of out west tend to be like a lighter green, and they just don't get that depth and girth and everything. Are those smallies that you guys have down there kind of that real like dark green variety with the red eyes, or what do they
So,
look like?
so interesting you say that. Our spotted bass they look, I'm telling you from the looks of them, if I showed you a spot and I showed you a largemouth, you almost couldn't tell the difference, except that a largemouth, you can tell a little bit from the markings, because the markings on a spotted bass are definitely darker and more defined. The spot going down, there's a line of spots that go down his lateral line in the middle that you can tell the difference between a largemouth and a Kentucky spot. But the easiest way to tell, obviously, is if you were to look at where his jaw, the middle of his jaw, where he opens his mouth, the crease in the back of his mouth. On a largemouth, that crease goes to just around the eye or just behind the eye on a largemouth. Whereas on a smallmouth or a Kentucky spot, it's in front of that eye because they just don't have that big mouth. And so you can see just from the alignment of the jaw crease, you can tell whether you've got, if you weren't able to look at something and go, oh, that's a largemouth or that's a spot, that would be the easiest way to tell for certain.
Gotcha. Yeah, I'm looking this up right now for reference here. It's interesting how you can kind of be around anglers for most of your life, and then there's these little regional things that you never hear about. And I
Well,
have never heard about Kentucky spotted bass.
we also have a bass down here, a species called a shoal bass, SHOAL. And those look exactly like smallmouths. You almost can't tell the difference. And we have them, they're native to Georgia only. And you
Huh.
catch them in rivers. And we have a great river fishery just north and just south of Atlanta for shoal bass. And they're another, just a native species you can't catch anywhere else in the country. And they're fantastic. They are just like, I mean, again, you look at a shoal bass and you look at a smallmouth, and some guys can't tell the difference. They've got the red eye and the whole 9 yards. My spots don't. My spots clearly look like more like a large mouth. Clearly look more like it. But when you're fighting one, you would swear you were fighting a smallmouth because they just dog it and dig and pull, and they just don't give up. A largemouth. I'm not dissing any fish. I love all fish with fins. But a largemouth, the beautiful thing about a largemouth bass is, especially if you're fishing a popper, it's one of the great takes in fly fishing is catching a largemouth on a popper.
Yeah.
Once you hook them, it's almost like fighting, for lack of a better term, and not to sound disrespectful, it's like fighting a boot full of urine, But whereas a Kentucky spot will dog it all. I mean, he's got attitude. There's no question.
Okay, I've never heard that analogy before. I might have to, if I borrow that from you in the future, do I have to pay you royalties on that
No,
one?
no. You can that's just we've just heard that. Listen, you're out in Montana, so I know you're fishing for a lot of fish that have dots on them. You're fishing browns and rainbows, and I love, having grown up in the Northeast, I love my trout. Unfortunately, here in the South, while we do have a great trout fishery down here in Atlanta, believe it or not, we're as far south as we are. We have a natural reproducing brown trout fishery in the Chattahoochee River below Lake Lanier, inside Metro Atlanta. Self-sustaining naturally. They haven't stocked a brown trout in that river in probably 15 years. And every year, some of the gear guys are pulling out fish between 10 and 18 pounds
Wow.
out of this river. But that being said, and I don't fish a lot of trout down here anymore, just because I was a dry fly snob up in the Northeast. I just, Justin, if you put me on a river in Montana and said, if you streamer fish or you nymph fish, you'll catch 30 fish today. But if you dry fly fish, you may only catch five. I'd spend all day catching five fish. I'm good. I am so good with dry fly fishing. I either like to fish super skinny or on top. That's my, if I was not guiding, that's what I would be doing. So, that's the beauty anyway. Coming back, that's the beauty of a largemouth fishery, is that, during the right time of year you can fish them on top. And it's one of the great takes.
Yeah, I fully 100% agree with everything you said there as far as the largemouth eat goes. Yeah, I find myself, it's funny you mentioned that because I do guide trout. But if I have days to fish, I more often than not go target pike
There
or
you
try to
go.
find a bass lake, or I go smallmouth fishing because I love all that stuff too. And, just like you, there's not a fish with fins that I don't want to go after. But just when you're guiding for trout all the time, when you have your personal days to get out, sometimes it's nice to go explore something else. And pike are delicious eating too. And we'll save some smallmouth in some of these rivers where it's going to probably be better for the population if you take some of those 13, 14 inches out of there.
Well, if you like eating pike, if you mixed it with a little carp, you'd have yourself your gefilte fish.
Okay, well, I'll
Yeah,
take your word for that.
yeah, that's you get that up in New York.
Well, these shoal bass are really beautiful. I just been looking at images of them here.
Yeah, they're real pretty. They're real pretty, and we fished that in. I don't personally guide for that, but my buddies up at Unicoi Outfitters in North Georgia do guide trips for those fish. And in the summertime, they'll take you out in starting around the end of June through most of August as that water gets lower in the summer. These fish in the river, you're fishing a river that's probably no more. You'll be in a raft, a two-man plus the rower, so a three-man raft. You'll go down the river. I don't think it's 120 feet from one side of the river to the other, and all you'll do is throw poppers, and boogle bugs and stealth bombers, and it's all on top in the summertime, and it's just great fun on six weights here in North Georgia. So Georgia has a pretty diverse fishery, all things considered. Considering we're not near the ocean, and like I said, I'm a dyed-in-the-wool saltwater guy, but I've made do. I married a Southern girl, ended up down here, and so now I'm taking advantage of what Atlanta has to offer. And so we have good striper fishing, good bass fishing, pretty good trout fishing, I'd say too. And then the carp fishing, that to me is the bomb. I just can't get enough of that. I can't wait till May comes around and I break out the little towy technical skiff and just pull around in 10 inches of water. Is just, to me, there's just no more fun than doing that.
Well, you guys do have that Cumberland Island area, right? That I got to go there one time. That was a really beautiful place.
That is a pretty place down on the shore. Yeah, Georgia has some beautiful coast. There's no question, and they get down there. They got a great red fishery, along with they get some tarpon. That they're learning how to figure out how to fly fish for tarpon down there. They've been catching them for years on bait and stuff, but they're starting to really do a good job with tarpon. And then they have everything else: the sea trout and the flounder and jacks and some false albacore a little bit, some bonita, some ladyfish, and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's a pretty good mix. It's a pretty good mix down on the coast. But again, like I said, we're 250 miles from the coast, so our saltwater fishery is Lake Sidney Lanier and our stripers, and that's an 8-9 weight fishery because our fish average between 6 and 8 pounds, and catching 12, 14, 15 pound stripers is not all that uncommon. And we're going through a stage right now where we're seeing smaller fish versus larger fish over the last probably 4 or 5 years. When up until about 5, 6, 7 years ago, catching fish into the mid upper teens was not unusual, and catching fish in the 20s on fly. My biggest fish that I've got on the fly up there was 28 pounds, but I saw one that went 38 pounds. But, that's a great fishery for a freshwater fish and a fly rod. Just they pull great, and they're just a wonderful, wonderful fish. And it's becoming, striper fishing in freshwater is becoming really, really popular now around the country. And so that's kind of what led to, having the book come out recently as well.
Yeah, let's talk about that book a little bit.
Well, so about 3 years ago, I got a phone call from one of my dear friends who's unfortunately not around anymore. Lefty Cray was a very dear friend of mine. I used to speak to Lefty just about every 2 or 3 weeks. We would get on the phone for 20 minutes and jaw just to check up on each other. And one day I got a phone call, and Lefty called me I don't remember when it was, March or April of 17. And he said, Henry, I'm getting so many emails and letters from people about stripers and hybrids in fresh water. And, there's nothing with regards to fly fishing written on them. And we need a book. The industry needs a book. And he goes, you need to write the book. He goes, you are so dialed in, and you have such good friends with other striper guys around the country in freshwater. He goes, you really, don't say no to me on this. And, when Lefty asks you to do something, it's like, it's like the Godfather asking you to do something, you just say, okay, I'll do it. So I agreed to do it. And then, I put the outline together, and I spoke to people all around the country that are big fly anglers for striped bass, just to get their take on what it's like out by them. And guys like Dan Blanton on the West Coast, and Dave Whitlock in Oklahoma, and Bill Butts in Missouri, in that area of the south central part of the country. And just talk to a lot of people. Blaine Chocolate in Virginia is a dear old friend of mine. And so we just spoke to them, and I just kind of found out what I already had known, but I needed that to be, qualified, that stripers don't know where they live. So a guy fishing for them in San Luis out in California, Northern California, versus a guy fishing Norfolk Lake, versus a guy fishing Smith Mountain Lake in Virginia, and here in Lake Lanier in Georgia. We all have the same problems, and we all find the same patterns. And so basically, they don't know where they live, and so they all kind of react the same way. So anyway, long story short, I put the book together, and it took a little bit longer, Justin, than what I thought it would take. Lefty got sick and passed away while I was in the writing of it, and the minute he passed away, it hit me like a ton of bricks. It was almost like losing a second dad. I was very close with him, and so I didn't pick the book up for about 7 or 8 months. I guided, but I didn't even fun fish a whole lot for myself. I just, realized later that I was grieving. I just had no interest in doing all that stuff. And finally, I got out of that funk and finished up the book. And I called Dave Whitlock and said, Dave, I'm writing this thing. Would you write the forward? And he goes, man, not only would I write the forward, how would you like some illustrations for the book? And, that was, I was over the moon to have Dave Whitlock, who's one of the great fishing artists in our industry, want to offer up some of his illustrations on temperate bass or stripers and hybrids. And he did, and we got it done, and the book is now out. It was released about 3-4 weeks ago. It just got out on for sale. And so, it's available on Amazon and Books A Million. And Barnes and Noble, and then there's places like Flyman Fishing Company is selling it, as well as fly shops around the country. It's Skyhorse produced it, which is the old Lions group, Nick and Tony Lions. They're the guys that published the book. So we'll see. It seems like it's doing well. I don't know. They haven't really said much, and so we're just getting out and promoting it now. So. But like I said, I was very blessed to have a lot of friends in the industry who were able to help out and lend either advice or photos and whatnot to get this thing done. I was very, very fortunate when it came to photography. Josh England was my photographer in the book. And I also had a few from David Cannon. And these are two guys that have written for just about every fly fishing publication out there. And they happen to be friends that live here in North Georgia that happen to love striper fishing. So they had a lot of photographs that we were able to pillage from. And that, to me, that's really what made the book. Is we've got just great, very artistic photos and a lot of photos of explaining to folks what to do and how to target these things. It's not a lot of stuff about just showing fish and pictures of hero shots, but when we talk about in the book fishing a blow through, we took a shot of we took a picture of what a blow through looks like from above, using a drone. So you could clearly see what a blow through is. Same thing when we talk about fishing like pockets. We use terminology like fishing pockets. And a lot of guys just don't know, when you're talking about a lake, what's a pocket? Well, we took a drone shot and showed people what pockets are. So we're hoping it's going to be enough to get people started.
Cool. And the book is called Fly Fishing for Freshwater Striped Bass, correct?
Yep.
Just
that's the name of the book.
pretty straightforward.
Pretty straightforward. Interestingly enough, Justin, there are one of our bait and tackle shops here that does very little fly fishing, but is on Lake Lanier, is selling the book as well, Hammond's Fishing Center, just because while it's called Fly Fishing for Freshwater Stripers, truth be known, of the 9 chapters, 2 are probably dedicated to fly fishing with regards to tackle, flies, lines, yada, yada, yada. The other 7 chapters really are all about how to locate and find striper and hybrid fisheries on lakes and rivers around the country. So even if you're a conventional guy and you're listening to the February podcast here, there's enough in it. Even if you're not a fly fisherman, you're going to get enough out of that book to get you started in the right direction for these fish.
Cool. And, getting back to talking about patterns, you mentioned that, yourself and some of the other dedicated bass fishermen around the country kind of all end up fishing somewhat similar flies. Can you tell me about your series of flies? Because I know you've developed several.
Yeah. So, I'm with Umpqua Feather Merchants. I started out many years ago with Orvis. I was on their royalty fly designer program, and I skipped over to Umpqua, and I've been a royalty tyer for those guys for probably close to 20 years now. And 90% of my flies are flies for saltwater or warm water use. They're flies for stripers and bass, false albacore, things of that nature, snook. And then a little more recently, I shouldn't say a little more recently. The most recent fly I've got out with them is a redfish fly called the redfish scampi. And that came from a fly that Umpqua took from me back in the early 2000s, which is called a bonefish scampi, which is, easily one of their top bonefish flies that they sell when they put a package of flies together. If you wanted to just buy like their Bahamas selection or their flat selection, and they give you, 10 different flies in an assortment, the bonefish scampi is one of them. It's just been a really good pattern for catching bonefish all around the world. And so that morphed into the redfish scampi, which is very similar, just tied bigger and in different colors to provoke a redfish to eating the fly in shallow water. It looks like a shrimp type pattern. And but most of my flies, I will say this, there's two types of tyers out there, Justin, when it comes to tying. This is the way I see it. There's guys, and we all go back to, Bob Popovics once said, a fly should be designed to solve a problem. And those were brilliant words, and he's right. And so there are guys that tie flies that are innovators, guys like Popovics and Chocolate and Charlie, Blaine Chocolate and Charlie Bisharod and, Joe Blados with his crease fly and
Bob Krauser.
Bob Klauser and David Nelson. These are guys that have
Dave Whitlock,
Dave Whitlock for sure. These are
James
guys.
Hopper won,
Yeah, I mean, so these guys have come out with, and the guys I'm naming are mostly saltwater type guys, saltwater and warm water type fly guys, and they've designed flies that are just the most innovative, never been seen before. And then there are guys that tie what I like to call guide flies, where they may take a pattern, find that there's an issue with something, and for lack of a better term, they build a better mousetrap. And
Right.
whether it's adding, different materials that make a big difference, or putting a lip on a fly, or just changing it slightly, that's the realm I fall in. I'm not an innovative tyer. I'm not a Blaine Chocolate or a Bob Popovics or a Dave Whitlock. I tie guide flies that work in certain situations that I needed to correct. And, one of my early flies that I designed, and this is coming from, I fished conventional long before I was a fly fisherman in New York City. And my best striper lure back in the day was a lure called a road runner. And a road runner is similar to a bucktail jig, but it has a spinner blade on the front. And I used to be on the rocks fishing a road runner, and I would outfish 4 guys lined up on either side of me. I'd outfish them 5-1 because of that spinner blade. So when I got into fly fishing and I saw, the first thing I said is, how do I design a road runner for fly fishing? And I looked at the Klauser minnow, which was tied with all bucktail at the time, and I said, well, that's a good design. Now let me just add a spinner blade to that and put some rabbit on there to get more wiggle in there, to get it to breathe more. And all of a sudden, we had a fly called the coyote that to this day is still being tied by Umpqua and is a very successful fly. And the reason it's called a coyote, if you remember the cartoon, The Road Runner, what followed the Road Runner?
The coyote.
There you go. So that's how that fly, because it was designed after a road runner lure for fly fishermen. So it got its name, the coyote. And so, or the coyote, either one. Either way, you fish it, you got to howl at the moon. That's all you need to know.
That thing would tear the smallmouth up around here. I'm certain of it.
Yep.
I'm looking at it right now.
Yeah, it's a really good fly. Talking about smallmouth, one of our buddies in the industry, Brad Beefus, who's the president of Cy Anglers, that he said is his favorite smallmouth fly to use. So it's a good fly. There's a lot of good flies. The hardest part, getting back real quick to the book, was you could write a whole book on striper flies. There's probably 500 flies that would take a striped bass. So my whole thing, flies are so subjective that the easy thing to do was to just say, I'm gonna put together a list of the top 13, a baker's dozen of 13 flies, some top water, some subsurface. And in these 13 flies, if you put them in a box and start in California and drive east to Pennsylvania, you'll be able to catch stripers in any lake or river across the country. And so that's kind of what we decided to do in the book.
Got it. Well, Henry, this has been a highly entertaining and informative conversation for me. Really can't thank you enough for taking the time to chat with us and share all of your knowledge on bass fishing. And it's just been a treat. But I'd love to hear one more personal fly fishing story from the archives. If you got one more for us.
I've got a quick one for you. And this happened to me back in the early 2000s. I used to, and I haven't done it in the last year and a half because of COVID, or last year, but I was a member of the Yellow Dog advisory team for for back in the day. And so I ran trips all over the world with fly fishermen. And one day I ran a trip into Abaco in the Bahamas, and we were fishing Rickman's Lodge and Sandy Point. And I took myself and 7 other anglers, 8 of us went out, and we get in the boat one morning and we all take off and go in different directions. And my guide that day, along with my fishing companion, decided we're going to go fish the marls. It's about a 50-minute run, but we're going to go fish the marls, which is a very famous bonefish area in the Bahamas. And we went back into the marls, and we got about 2 miles into the marls, and we were fishing and catching fish and having a ball. And all of a sudden, it's about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Justin, and the guide starts up the engine, gives it the gas to go, and we spun the prop. And are you familiar with spinning in the prop, what that means?
Yeah, I have. I have witnessed that before. Not on a boat that I've been on, but I've heard of it.
Yep. So the prop didn't seal with the hub any longer, and so the prop spins but doesn't catch, so that you can't go anywhere. It just spins, but the boat doesn't move. And here we are 2 miles back in the marls, in the middle of nowhere, at 1:30 in the afternoon. And I look at my guide and I said, Kendall, no problem, dude. Just call Ricardo, who owns the lodge. I said, call Ricardo up and have him come get us. And he looks at me and goes, oh, man, I dropped my phone in the water 2 weeks ago. I hadn't had a chance to get a new phone, so I don't have I have no way of calling him. And I'm going, you got to be kidding me. So here we are, 2 miles in the marls, and I'm like, now what do we do? So I look at my buddy Ricky, who's with me, and Ricky's like, look, we got to fix the hub. I said, okay. He goes, we got to take the cotter pin out, take the prop off, and we got to screw screws into the rubber hub, and then put the prop back on, put the cotter pin back on, and hopefully that will be enough grip to catch for the hub to catch the prop. And I'm like, okay. So the guy takes out this old rusted screwdriver, and we find a couple screws in the boat that, were coming out. It was an old, whatever it was, a dolphin skiff back in the day. We take out 2 screws, we take the prop off, and we put the screws into the prop, and we start to go, and we get up to about 5 miles an hour. It's working. And all of a sudden, we probably went about 200 yards, and he gives it the gas, and he spun the prop again. Well, I'm going to tell you, to make a long story short, Justin, this went on for the next 3 hours. We kept taking screws off the console and around the boat. Wherever we saw a screw, we just kept taking screws off, fixing the hub, screwing it in, putting the prop back on, and going. And after he spun the prop about 5 or 6 times, I just said, look, we're going to do this again. You're not going to go above 5 miles an hour. Get us out of the marls. And so sure enough, we took 2 more screws. We put it in. I'm guessing at this point, we've got 14, 16 screws in this hub. And finally, it works, and he doesn't go above 5 miles an hour, and he gets us out to the opening, back to the ocean. And as the sun is setting at 7:30 at night, we see a boat coming in the distance, and it was Ricardo. And he had found us, and he towed us back to the dock, back at Abaco at Rickman's Lodge. And I swear to you, Justin, when we got back to the dock, you could have taken the console and lifted it up and put it on the dock. There was not a screw left in that boat. We had unscrewed the entire boat to get out of the marls, so that we could get back to civilization. We were already rationing, nutrition bars and water. We had already planned on spending the night in that skiff. But fortunately, we were found, and we made it back. And from that day forward, any trip that I've ever gone on where I've gone in an outfitter to one of these countries out of, I don't want to call it a third world, but one of these non-USA kinds of outfitting lodges, I make sure that the lodge manager has written down where every guide is going every day, because I don't trust satellite phones and everything else, batteries, this and that. I want my people knowing if something happens, I want to know the area where they're fishing. And what a lesson learned that was.
Well, I guess that which doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
That's right. That's right.
You bet. You bet. Well, Henry, folks can find you at, is it henrycowenflyfishing.com?
Yep, Cowen, Henry Cowen, flyfishing.com.
Yep, they can track you down there. You have an Instagram account?
I do. It's just under Henry Cowen.
Okay, Henry Cowen on Instagram, and look for the book Fly Fishing for Freshwater Striped Bass, available on Amazon. And where else did you say other than fly shops?
You can get it from Flyman Fishing Company. You can get it from Books A Million, Barnes and Noble. And I have some limited edition hardcover copies. It's a soft cover book. It retails for $16.99. The hardcover edition is $32.99. It's $35 shipped. $35 shipped for a limited edition autographed hardcover edition from me if they're interested. And they can just email me. They can get my email address from the website from henrycowenflyfishing.com.
Go to thefebruaryroom.com, where you can access a complete library of our podcast and read more about our guests, their fishing stories, and favorite fly patterns. We're always looking for exceptional fly fishing yarns, and if you have one to spin, shoot us an email at info@thefebruaryroom.com. The February Room is always free, but if you feel like throwing a nickel in the pond, we appreciate any additional listener support. For companies and individuals interested in sponsorship opportunities, please contact us for our media kit. Thanks for stopping by the February Room, and we'll see you down here next week.